I was doing a coaching session with a lady from uh, northern Indiana, and she was really struggling, and part of what she was struggling with was how much she had overextended herself as a helper in people's lives, and how she had then kind of after doing that for so long had really gained the reputation of, for folks to she was everybody's 911 call. and, and so I had an epiphany in that moment as I was talking with her about, what, this is so common. I see this so often in efforts, the desire, the heartful desire, really, just to help, and then the overextension of that desire into a place. And so I named the topic for this podcast, "Servants, Not Saviors." And that was like a prickly porcupine topic label for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And I think for some people, a title like servant, it's helpful for them. So if you have the tendency to uh, n- not focus enough on serving, not focus enough on other people and what their thoughts and needs are, I think it's a really uh, a helpful word. But it was my fear that if you already had issues with holding appropriate boundaries and you're already very aware of other people's perspectives, you're very sensitive to that, that the word servant, I didn't feel like it brought up a very strong the imagery of a very strong leader.
Mm.
And I was afraid that, because when you think about a servant, uh, how many servants tell people no and hold boundaries? it it kind of brings something to mind that it's like, well, that's
Yeah.
not an option for a servant. They just have to do what they have to do. And that's not the case, but I was afraid that that was what would come to mind for people. And so I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that, like how you view servant and how it's not incompatible with having boundaries and being assertive.
Yeah, and I so much appreciate your response, because I think that might be the response of many listeners, right? Many folks out there who hear the word servant and think, "Oh boy, yeah, I just have to do what I'm told." But I believe in a servant like Jesus Christ, or a servant like I think it's Robert Greenleaf, who
Yeah.
really started the whole servant leadership movement a number of years ago. And so there's probably a healthy way to be a servant and an unhealthy way to be a servant. And maybe that's the polarity that we should explore today, is the healthy and the unhealthy aspects of being a servant leader in your life, whether it's a leader of your family at home, leader of your extended family, leader at work, leader amongst your friends at times when they need you, and things along those lines.
To me, it makes a lot of sense. If you're not a servant of the people that you lead, you there could become a time where you don't have anyone to lead. That
Yes.
people don't want to be along for the ride on something that's only about you.
Yes.
If it's not us, if it's not we, then you may find yourself not having anyone following, anyone to even lead. So
Yes.
it it seems so obvious, yet for some people it's not their default mode. And I'm a little bit ashamed to admit this. I don't think that it's my default mode. I think
Mm.
that it's the type of thing that I need to remind myself that I think that there are certain people that are very, using a different practice that's often used in coaching. I think there are people that are very grateful and they could practice gratitudes in the morning, and maybe they receive some benefit of it, but they're just a very kind of grateful just naturally, and
Hmm.
they don't get quite as much value out of it. And I think that there are other people that would need to rebalance in that way. So knowing which type of person you are, I think, is is really important. And I've always found it to be a useful frame for myself to make sure that I'm not in pursuit of my goals. Because when I get in pursuit of what I'm trying to achieve, am very focused on that, and I have to take a step back and think from the servant perspective.
Mm.
So I don't know. I believe that that might be different from most NFers. Most NFers don't have like that tunnel vision towards their goals, that they're focused on uh, other inputs that are coming in and saying yes to those other inputs. Like to me, those things are distractions. So I'm like I'm going, and it's easy for me to say no to things. What is it like for somebody that doesn't operate that way? That is very that feels the repercussions of saying no. That when you say no, there's usually a bit
Mm.
of a disappointment on the other person's face.
Yes.
How does somebody that is an intuitive feeler deal with maintaining those boundaries?
Well, it's a tough road to go, and I think that you make a couple of good points though. Before I answer that question, you talk a little bit about servants who are not active as a servant or in leadership, and that maybe the need for them to come into some awareness around that and some motivation to step into leadership in places where they're called to do so. Then you've got folks who are forward and open about leading and being servants in families, extended families at work, in marriage, in friendships as well. And so you make some good points there. I think that for most NFers, sometimes NFers are in the what we call the heart triad in the Enneagram. And the three numbers in the Enneagram that are considered the heart triad, any one of those three can be leaders. But I think the leader, the NFer that is a leader in say a two on the Enneagram, they sometimes have the most difficulty with maintaining or setting or feeling like they have the right to set boundaries. And so they extend and extend and extend. At work they might hear a need and jump in and say, "I can do that," and folks get accustomed to them being a player like that, and so they come then to that same person and continue to ask them to take on more and more and more, and the servant leader says yes and yes and yes, even to the point oftentimes when it's just too much and they're juggling too many projects, too many things at the same time. They're not taking care of themselves and get overwhelmed, get exhausted. Maybe they stop sleeping properly, and all kinds of consequences can come from that. And so in a work setting, let's say if we move forward with that, if that person begins to set boundaries, their worst fear is rejection, right? And that if I see that face that you were talking about, Aaron, that look on the face, and I say, I'm like, oh shit, I don't know if I could say no. There's a part of me as a helper healer that feels like I need to have that kind of approval to be okay myself. And so if I start to say no, then I don't get that approval. Does that mean I'm still going to be okay or I'm not going to be okay? And so there's some interestingly enough, maybe a little bit of selfishness around being a servant, where that you really have an expectation, whether you're aware of it or not, that there's some kind of reciprocity, some kind of acceptance, some kind of confirmation or affirmation that comes from things that I do to serve, and saying yes to things. I could potentially lose that if I start to say no. And then I think the most common experience that I find when I'm working with somebody who starts to set boundaries in their life, and they feel guilty, and I acknowledge and affirm that and say you're going to feel guilty for some time now. But it will not always feel this way. And so, an example, one lady that I worked with in coaching began to set some of these boundaries, particularly with family members. Then she had success doing that, felt terribly guilty about doing that, and then started setting boundaries at work. And again, felt guilty for saying no to requests or projects. and again felt guilty. But then over the course of our continued coaching time together, within about 4 months or so, she was talking about um, boundaries, and particularly at work. And I said, "You seem to be much lighter as you talk about that." And she said, "Yeah." She goes, I am a lot lighter." And through the course of setting the boundaries, staying with it consistently, and working on self compassion, her own level of personal self acceptance, she got much stronger in that way. And a few months later, she no longer had the guilt and continues to set boundaries today.
So I think everyone's probably clear that there's too much work for us to do, right? There's not many people that have not enough on their plate. So for most of us, it's not a matter of whether some of the work is not going to get done. That's given. Some of this work is not going to get done. There's not enough hours in the day to get all of this done.
Yes.
So we can prioritize and know what's important to us and make sure that those things stay high on the list. But one thing that I found that has kind of removes some of the burden of saying no is to shift that off to the other person. So, as you know, we use agile project management. So, we have a backlog of things that we would like to get to eventually. So, instead of me saying, no, I can't do that, and sometimes I might need to say, no, I can't do that if I don't have the
Hmm.
ability to do it or something else is taking priority. Other times, I just turn it around and show the client the number of things that needs to be done and have them help me prioritize it. So then
Hmm.
it doesn't feel as much like I don't want to. I do want to, but I also
Hmm.
want to do all these other things for you as well. So
Yes.
which one of these things would you like me to prioritize lower? So that makes that a possibility. And then they give the answer. I'm not even saying no. They're saying, okay, let's do put this on a someday maybe list, and then let's move
Yes.
that up because that I think that that's a higher priority. And then it takes the cognitive burden off of me, and then I know it's in alignment with what the client actually wants, and it it just takes the difficulty away while still holding the boundary. You're still acknowledging there's only so many hours in the day. There's only so much that one person can do. Um, but I want to put it back to you. Of these
Yeah.
20 things that we have working on, I'm probably going to be able to get maybe five of these done. Which ones? How do you want this ranked? And I found that super helpful because um, I'm focused on goals, but I often want to do everything. I mean, we have so many cool projects going on that I'm just excited to get to the stuff that's in our backlog. So I will say
Mm.
yes to things that and for me, it's not out of an area of guilt that I'll say yes. I'll say yes because I want to do it. Like I think that that's a
Hmm.
really cool project to work on, and then I sit back and reflect and think, oh, I shouldn't have done that like that. There's no way I have the ability to pull that off. But in the moment, you're making that emotional decision, whether it's driven by guilt or
Yeah.
driven by excitement, and you just act, and then in hindsight you have like a buyer's remorse or something where you're saying I shouldn't have done that. I don't know, can I return this? Like, can I how do
Yeah.
I go back on this commitment that I made? And
Well,
I just find having
yeah,
all that
yeah,
listed out lets me know, okay, well, for one, it makes
yes,
it abundantly clear how many projects you're working on. And this doesn't have to be, I know I'm saying clients, but this could literally be the tasks that you need to do around your home. It could be anything like that. But when you have them all listed out and prioritized, it's like, wow, that's a lot. You know, that's not, and then you can actually feel good about what you're not doing because it's in service of the things that are most important to you.
yeah. That is a fantastic way to conceptualize uh, self care, right, and productivity. And you make a nice point as well that us helper healer servants, we really enjoy helping. We really have the kind of heart that wants to make a difference in a family relationship with a friend or at work, so it's just kind of who we are, and so there's that can, as you said, can lead us to jump too far ahead and get excited and make a commitment that we really don't have the resources to really do on the priority list. I like your style also of it's brilliant, really. Your way of going back to a customer and having them prioritize for you, which in effect, what you're doing is saying, I can't do all of this right this moment. You
Yep.
have to help me decide what gets attention and what doesn't. And as you empower them to make decisions for their own business, of course,
Yep.
um, then it takes the burden off of you to have to make that decision yourself or to say no to something. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I think it's at least threefold. When you turn it around to the other person, it's the main reason that I started doing this was for the reason that I wanted to make sure that I was serving as effectively as possible. I wanted to make sure the things that were important to the client or the things that were getting done. But a side benefit of that was that it relieved the burden of me having to make this decision. Like I'm not actually
Yeah.
saying no. They're telling me which things to say no to. And I thought, well,
Yes.
that feels really nice to not have to. I'm holding the boundary, but in a way that is not. It doesn't have quite the same feeling. And then the other benefit is if that person leads a team or within an organization, they prioritized it for you. So if
Yes.
anyone else has a problem with that prioritization, it doesn't come to you. They go to bat for you. They say, no, 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 I prioritize that list. So
Yes.
and then they defend the position because they were a part of the prioritization process. And frequently you do have to prioritize things that there are hundreds of people involved with, but you have one point person. So having that point person make the decision means so much when they're sitting in a boardroom and they're being questioned about why this work is
Mm.
prioritized over that work. I don't want them to say, "Well, let me check with Aaron why he did that." I I want them to say because they know we have a whole lot of stuff that we're trying to achieve right now, and I prioritize that list based on these criteria. So they just defend you in that moment because it was their decision. Like they were part of it. Like, and it just has alleviated so many problems. It just seems like a win, win, win all the way around.
I love it. I love it. Say a little bit about why it became important for you to create and adopt that strategy. Why was it so important?
I'm gonna say pain
Mm.
was the reason. So we have a list of work that we can do, and to me, one of the worst feelings in the world is trying very hard to do something nice for somebody and they're not happy.
Mm.
They are maybe even aggravated with the work that you did. So you're like dumping everything that you got into something and then it they're just not happy with it. And it just feels so it's like I don't know if it's like a little kid that has a watercolor and they worked real hard on this thing and they present it
Mm.
to somebody and then they just yeah.
Falls flat. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it just feels so disappointing that you're so excited about it and you think that you're doing a good job all the way up to the moment of presenting, and then found it just is complete 180, and just taking that hit wasn't a pleasant experience. So I just started shifting that off to the client to make sure that we had alignment. That way, I'm
Mm.
not thinking one thing and they're thinking another thing. That we hash out and get clarity in the moment, and then that way, when we meet back in 2 weeks, it's a lot more likely that the work that was done is the client is going to be happy with that because
Yes.
they
Yes.
prioritized it. And when you don't have that back and forth communication and like even have the other person prioritize, there's a much greater probability that you're going to show up being excited about this work and thinking that you did a good job and then realizing I didn't do such a good job.
Yes.
And
So
as
you
I'm
may,
saying this, I can see how this relates to relationships and
yeah,
like
yeah.
all the other areas of your life
Reading,
as well.
reading my mind, reading my mind. Yes, yes. And the beauty of what you're talking about here is you're making the other party responsible for what they need to be responsible for. and NFers, healers, helpers, servants, we often take the entire onus of responsibility onto ourselves. And when you did that in your business, it was a painful experience, right? You worked your butt off, thought you were doing the right thing in serving your clients, and they were disappointed and rejected you and the work that you were doing. It was painful for you,
Hmm.
and you decided, you know what? They should be driving this process anyway. They should be making the decisions. They should be making the priority list. And I'm going to make them responsible for that because that's really theirs,
Yep.
not mine. I can do the work. They're in charge of the process, really. And I'm going to have them be responsible for it. And that it's absolutely applicable to relationships, to marriage. To having a partner, to your kids, even at home, to your coworkers at work, to be, and sometimes we get into in the field we call this enabling, right? We do too much for the other person out of love for them, out of fear of what might happen if we don't do for them and do for them and do for them. And what ends up happening oftentimes in relationships and in family relationships, is that we don't allow the other person to learn from their experience. We rescue them, we bail them out of jail, we do all sorts of things to out of love, right? And being a servant, out of being a supporter, we rob them of the opportunity for them to really hit bottom with that experience the bottom, learn something from it, and come out differently in the future. And if we rescue people at work, if we rescue our bosses at work, if we rescue our son, or even spouse, so much, they don't get the opportunity then to learn from failure, to learn from a bad choice, and they keep doing the same thing over and over again, which then compels you to have to do the same thing over and over again. We call that enabling.
This was another one of those things that early on in business that I did a lot. And I viewed it as protecting people from uncomfortable conversations. I didn't really want anyone to have to be a part of that conversation. And then I changed things where I encouraged our clients to give feedback, and not just to
Mm.
me. Like, just it's okay. Everyone has to be able to handle the feedback. Everyone has to, my main criteria is that it's kind and constructive, but
Mhm.
I don't protect people from hearing the things that they need to hear. And if their work is not up to par and somebody feels that way, it's okay that they hear that, so long as it is kind and constructive. That's totally appropriate. But early on, I would shield those conversations and I would run it through my filter. So what
Mm.
does that do? It enables, because the other person. So I'm taking all the heat, and then communicating it to the other person with no heat. So
Mm.
it makes the problem keep happening.
Mhm.
And, so it just doesn't really do the other person any service, even though you feel like you're doing a kind thing by not allowing them to feel that discomfort. You're just saving them the short term discomfort and a long term resentment that builds up after doing that for too much, because you're constantly taking the heat and they're getting worse because they don't know, they're not feeling any of the tension of that wasn't in alignment.
Yeah, and you feel worse and worse, exhaust yourself, work your tail off, and the other person begins to sometimes feel entitled, um, and then have an expectation that you're going to continue to take care of them in that same way. But you're right. Folks do this initially because they love somebody else, and they love a coworker or care about their boss, and so they do what they can to preserve them, to help them not have to hurt, from an experience or a choice. And I found out some years ago, really, that sometimes I have one intention in my mind, and I'll act on that intention, but I end up teaching something differently than what I had intended. And so sometimes we love somebody. Say you bail somebody out of jail after they get arrested for a DUI, and I feel like I'm helping and supporting and loving. And maybe the first DUI, that's appropriate or fine, but after the second or third, or the continued daily drinking and those kinds of things, then I begin to give too much. And then what I'm teaching is not love and support. It's I'm going to take care of all your responsibilities, because that's what I've said in my actions and what I continue to do.
Here's something that is slightly related, and but I think that it's worth throwing out because it is related, and it was also another transition that I went through. It's empowering team members to make decisions for themselves.
Hmm.
So initially, I would take on the burden of making decisions when that team member is better suited to make that decision, anyways. So,
Hmm.
like, why would I take on the burden of making that decision when they're more competent within that area than I am, and they know the whole list of things that are on their plate, so they're going to make a better decision anyways. So when I started delegating the decisions out to people, I felt like that made my life a whole lot easier as well.
Yes.
And it's slightly related, but it's kind of one of those things that when I first showed up, when I first started going into business for myself, I felt like my job is to have the answers. Like that's what
Hmm.
I do. I have the answers. I'll solve it. I'll do that. And then the longer that I've been in, I find myself just pushing the question back. Like how would you answer this? Or
Yes.
the
Yes.
client wants something done, and I tell them, well, help me prioritize this list. I'm more than happy to do what you'd like. Or our team members, I say, hey, why don't you answer this one? And it just takes so much burden off of you. And initially, I felt guilty for doing that. Like, am I being lazy by not answering questions, by giving it to other
Hmm.
people? No, the clients feel happier because the right work's getting done, and the team members feel happier because you're not giving them work to do. They're deciding what work gets done and how it gets done, and
Absolutely.
so it's just so much better. But it's
Yes.
weird that initiating that process made me feel guilty and lazy when it was a
Yes.
better thing to
Yes.
do.
Well, you're fighting some of the stigma of what leaders, what we think leaders are really supposed to be about, right? If I'm a leader, that I'm supposed to have all the answers, right? It's my job to have all the answers. It's my job to be omnipresent, omnipotent, and, and
Yep.
powerful. And you stepped back from that piece of stigma and said, "No, I don't. This is not the way it's going to work here. We're going to do something different. I'm going to empower people to have the answer." Outside of me on my team, I hired them for very special reasons. They have talents and gifts, and I'm just going to let them squirm a little bit sometimes, right, till they come up with the right answer, and then we have it. I have a happy client as a result of that work. I'm happier as a result of that work, and my employees are more confident and empowered. It's not it's so we do this in different situations. This happens for you at work. It was
Mm-hmm.
a hard process. You felt maybe a little bit guilty about it. Felt like maybe you weren't doing things right, or the way that leaders are supposed to.
Yep.
Um, and I see this. I worked with a lady who had multiple family members who just burned her phone up every single day, and she talked about one family member. They had a combination of mental health issues and health issues as well, and they would burn her phone up every single day. And so what I did with her as a way to start setting boundaries, and do something very similar to what you're talking about, Aaron, is I had her build a resource list for them. And then I had her give that resource list to that family member, and all the folks that lived in that household. And she started to say things like, "Here's your options. You're in charge, really." And so before you call me, check out the resources list, because I know that everything that you need can be covered by one of these six resources that I've written down for you. I've got the contact information for you. If it comes to the worst case scenario, you call 911 and an ambulance will come and help. I am not going to be your 911 any longer. And she again felt very guilty about that at first. They were very angry about that. because they were unaccustomed to having to really take charge. They just dumped it all on her, and then she had to run with the ball. And so she changed the dance there, began to set boundaries, help them really with some resources in ways they could help themselves out and be empowered to do so. And so she gets fewer calls today. It took a little while. I made this transition too a long time ago in my life, and I remember one of the first places I began to set boundaries was with my family of origin. As I began to do that, I would go back for family gatherings at holidays and things. I would hear things like, Dave, you're just not the same. And they didn't mean that in a good way. Dave, you just feel like you're kind of like separate from us now. Like somehow we're not in your circle anymore. I heard things like, Dave, you just don't feel like part of the family anymore. And several other more harsh things were said as well. And I was in therapy at the time, thank God. And so I would feel guilty and ashamed initially from those comments, take it back to my therapist, sit in the office and talk about it. And as I processed through it, I began to understand and accept that they were in a change process that I started. I started this for myself. I started to practice self compassion, self care, have good boundaries, not just with my family of origin, but with everybody in my life. And it rocked the ship. And my family pressured me to come back into the fold and be the way that I always have been. And I stayed the course. And was able to maintain those boundaries, and those relationships with my family of origin rebalanced and became healthier as a result.
I feel like that's a fascinating topic for maybe a future podcast. That we fulfill these different roles, and um, there are a lot of forces that resist change, uh,
Mm,
internally and externally. And sometimes those external forces are at odds with the internal change that you're seeking to make.
yes,
But if you don't
yes.
make those changes, and it's tough because I think that there are some real realities to face. Some people
Hmm.
will not accept the new version of you.
That's right.
But the people that do accept the new version of, and they will, there's a lot of people that will accept the new version of you. Um, it's so much better. Those are the people that you want to be around, anyways. So, you start holding boundaries. And one thing that I noticed with holding boundaries, when I first started doing that with like turning questions around to the client and saying, "Here's the list of here's all the projects and next actions that we have scheduled for you. Help me prioritize this list." Well, somebody that's not used to that happening, they may get aggravated, and they could get so fed up that they're just tired of you doing that. They just want you to do all the things. But people that are high performers are sometimes even impressed. Like, you really have control over this. Like,
Mm,
you know what's going on. You know what all of our projects are. You know what the next actions on all of our projects. They're all prioritized. You care that I have the agree with the prioritization, that that's how everything should be, and they just look at you like, nicely done. Like, that's, you did a great job. So it is interesting that as you create internal change, your external world begins to shift too, and there's a little bit of management on that side as well. And I'm tempted to get
hmm.
into it, but we're already at 41 minutes, and I think that it is an important enough of a topic to have a completely separate episode for that.
Let's do that. And so that could be the teaser for you listeners today, to be able to come back, maybe even in our next podcast, as we explore this whole dynamic of self preservation, of pulling in and coming home to yourself in a self caring, self compassionate way. Also, maybe talking a little bit about the difficulty of that path, the courage that it really takes. To care for yourself, to have boundaries around who you are and who you're going to be in the world. Again, for you UNFers out there, that something in this podcast resonated with you. got you excited, got you motivated, or got you even more curious. Please interact with our video podcast. Leave comments or leave questions as well. We do want to make this all about what you need. And we have a pretty good sense of what that might be, but we don't have the whole picture. You have to help us fill that in. I'm doing right now exactly what Aaron did in his business. I'm turning the question around in this podcast at the end here, turn it around on you listeners and asking you, what about this topic or conversation are you curious about, or that you're confused about, or you'd like to learn more about? We'd love to hear it.